Most of us are acutely aware of inflation every time we go through the checkout line at the grocery store.
That was a 1980 broadcast on how to cope with price rises when inflation had soared to average nearly 15%.
It's not as high as that currently, but last year inflation here in the US hit 7% and was even higher for some goods. Gasoline prices doubled, while the price of meat, fish and eggs surged by more than 12%. And speaking of eggs,
I will never forget this one day that I came down getting myself ready to go to school and basically getting an egg carton out of the refrigerator and opening it up and then dropping an egg, and it splattered on the floor. And my mother went crazy. She was like, what are you doing? You're wasting food. You can't do that. You have to be more attentive. And I was like, oh, wait, this is something that's not out of proportion to what just happened.
Historian Kevin Mattson was a teenager when President Jimmy Carter was struggling with soaring inflation, symbolized by gasoline shortages and price surges driven largely by the oil supply crisis of the early 1970s.
Inflation has, therefore, been a serious problem for me ever since I became president. We've tried to control it, but we have not been successful.
As the US central bank raised its benchmark rate aggressively to cool prices, inflation peaked in 1980. But that was too late for Carter. The following year, he was out of office after just one term. Some critics think he was too preoccupied with trying to counter what he considered short-term individualism harming society to focus on more tangible problems.
Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns.
And with the US experiencing a dark moment in history under the COVID-19 pandemic, there are obvious comparisons.
I personally don't have this, but I know that it's a shared viewpoint, which is the idea that Joe Biden's not up to it. He's not capable of really taking on the issues and getting them under control.
But the US economy today isn't in the doldrums like it was under Carter, so perhaps we need to look further back.
The Allied armed forces have been ordered to suspend offensive action.
Newsmen rush the president's report to a waiting world.
The end of the Second World War in 1945 triggered an unprecedented demobilization. Coffee and donuts for these returning US troops, just a taste of the pent-up demand that would follow the lifting of wartime price controls and rationing. By early 1947, inflation was running up more than 20%.
and that post-Second World War period is arguably a more accurate comparison. The current inflation crisis has been partly driven by people emerging from the most stringent COVID-19 restrictions with money to spend in an economy that's largely bounced back very strongly from the pandemic. But ongoing labour shortages means some suppliers haven't been able to keep up with demand, squeezing supply and driving up prices.
And some goods, such as used cars, have witnessed price rises far beyond the average inflation over the past year. But the US Central Bank expects inflation to cool over the next 12 months as it starts to raise its benchmark rate while hoping to keep the economy motoring. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.